Not many people will forget in a hurry the events of October last year in Nigeria when youths in their hundreds and thousands were on the streets for days making one singular demand. But that demand, that activity snowballed into a series of other activities that didn't leave very sweet taste in the mouth of many. Over 100 days after, we are still counting the cost and trying to pick the pieces of that NSAS protest of last year, 2020. With me on the special interview is spokesperson of the Youth Rights Campaign, Hassan Taiwo. We'll be speaking through some of the issues that emanated from that protest. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time.
It's my pleasure.
Now, the protest is over, so to say. And let's begin with assessing what the gains of that protest primarily are. What would you consider to be the gains of the protest?
Well, I think primarily the most cogent gain we can point to is the fact that the youth were able to demonstrate to the ruling elite that they are a force to be reckoned with and that they are not going to tolerate the conditions which they had tolerated in the past. I think that gain is very cogent, and going forward, it's likely going to be something that the ruling elite will not quickly forget when they take actions in the coming period.
But it's also, let's also look at what appeared to be the major demand. When the protest began, the demand was just one: end police brutality, being symbolized by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS. And but as the days, came and went by, the demand began to expand until we got what was called 5 for 5. Government quickly accepted that. So talk us through what those 5 demands were and the ones that you believe that government had addressed and the ones that are pending.
Well, the only aspect of the 5 for 5 demands that we can say have been accepted and implemented by government is actually the banning or the dissolution rather of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. That's the only cogent thing that we can point to, that government has done in terms of the 5 for 5 demand. But then, as soon as government accepted to do that, if we can all recall, the same government also said that a new body called SWAT was going to be set up. And when the modus operandi of that new body was explained, it became clear that it was simply going to be a replacement of one, vicious organization by another. And even 100 days after, it's very clear from the testimony of many Nigerians that SARS actually still exists, possibly under the radar. For instance, the protesters who were arrested, on February 13th, Saturday, during the protest at the Lekki toll gate, actually testified, that some operatives of that body, of that defunct body, were actually part of those who tortured them. So there's a way that
they were policemen fundamentally.
They were policemen, yes.
The people that arrested people at the toll gate on February 13 were policemen.
Yeah, they were.
So is it not possible that the people testifying or claiming that SARS still exists under the cover may be mixing things up?
They are not mixing things up, because that's not the only revelation that we have had. Even if you leave the testimony of the protesters, there have been Nigerians who have cried out on social media, including Twitter, of how they have been brutalized or arrested by operatives who actually identified themselves as SARS, or how they were taken to police outposts that were identified as SARS buildings. So all of this, but then even beyond the fact that SARS may still exist under the radar, the reality is that after the dissolution of SARS, police brutality has continued to manifest in different dimensions. And all of that contributes to this feeling 100 days after that perhaps none of those basic demands of the 5 for 5 demands have actually been genuinely implemented. The 5 for 5 demands were clear demands of the movement. They were demands meant to test the government, to see whether that government was prepared to even begin to take to account, what the youth have suffered, in this country over decades. And the failure of that government really, to demonstrate in practice that it was prepared to meet those demands genuinely, I think it's something that will not leave the memory of many young people, in times to come. But for us, for myself as a socialist, I think it only answers the question of what really, the state is all about.
Okay, but I would like to butt in here because I would like us to look at those demands a little bit more specifically. One of the demands talked about dissolution of SARS. We agree that that has been taken care of. Yes, you quarrel with the establishment of SWAT, but authorities or those who understand security system say that you cannot have a vacuum. You need a strategic, critical body of the police to respond to certain needs, which informed the creation of SWAT. But other needs, other demands in that list includes training of the personnel, that were involved in SARS operations before they are redeployed. That has been carried out.
Well, they claim it has been carried out, but I'm not aware of any independent assessment of how that has been carried out. Okay. There's also the question of psychological evaluation. Okay. I'm also not aware of any independent assessment.
Well, but the police authorities said when they were establishing SWAT that anybody who was in SARS will not be in SWAT.
They said that, but there has been no independent assessment.
So there may not be any independent assessment.
The point I'm making really is that the purpose of the import of the NSAS protest really was to call out the government, to show that the public, are prepared to shine light on any inadequacy of government, whether in the area of security or in any other way. So if the state was also going to begin to demonstrate a change of heart, then things have to be done in the open. The public must be able to monitor what is actually being done. Since the NSAS protest, very little has been heard about what has been done actually on the ground. There's also part of the demands also included improvements in the pay and working conditions of the police. That has not been done up till now. The police still buy their uniform, they still contribute money and all of that. And bribery and corruption of the police still exists, still manifests on a daily basis. So that, to me, it appears that what has actually happened was the government agreeing to accept the demands only to get the protesters off the street. But as soon as the protest ended, things appear to have returned back to their normal state.
I had a chat with the Inspector General of Police some weeks back where he said that every documentation concerning the review of police salary had been signed, and then they are at the point of agreeing on all the adjustments, which makes it clear that, well, change of or review of salaries for civil servants is not something that can be achieved overnight. Don't you think so?
Obviously, it can be achieved.
So they require time.
Oh, yes.
To achieve it.
When the time comes, we will see.
What are the strategies you and others like you who were involved in the protest? Let's quickly point out that there wasn't a specific leader so there were units of leaders, in several places and several units. So you were part of them, in one area. What other strategies are you adopting to engage government further? Because if you don't engage government further to ensure that all your demands are met, including review of police salary and improvement in their welfare, we may not have achieved a lot. So what other strategies are you adopting to engage government for this purpose?
The government has demonstrated since the protest last year that it is not available for engagement. Because by engagement, what I understand by that is a follow-up to see that the promises are kept. But since the end of the protest, the government has made it clear that rather than bring down repression, it is actually ramping it up. On November 7, we were repressed. On February 13, we were repressed. if the government wants to continue to engage, it will not continue to unleash the kind of mayhem that we have seen since the NSAS protest ended. Since that time, protest has almost practically been outlawed by the government.
Apart from protests, what other means of engagement?
So that's where I'm going with that. You can't sit down with the government for any discussion. A government that is still throwing activists into detention for simply gathering for a rally. So the government has made any possible engagement impossible since the end of the protest. So that is not even in our strategy right now. What is in our own strategy right now, which the movement has been discussing, is how to reignite the movement. Because obviously it is clear that the objectives of that movement have not yet been accomplished.
If the objective of that movement is ending police brutality and, through the scrapping of SARS have been scrapped, and yes, there are still evidence of police brutality here and there, but would another protest address that need?
Yes, it will. Especially a protest that is more determined, that is clearer about its objectives, that has a clear leadership with a clear objective. And I must also make this point very clear, that the objective of the NSAS protest goes far beyond the question of police brutality.
But actually, that was the foundation.
That's the foundation, but from foundation, you erect a building. It was the uprising of the youth against the intolerable condition of this country, not just in the area of police brutality, but also in the area of unemployment, of mass poverty in the midst of abundance, of lack of opportunities that bedevils this country. And all of those indicators that I have just mentioned still exist up to now. In fact, they continue to worsen. So that any new movement that breaks out tomorrow will not just be engaging the government on the question of police brutality, but also on all of these issues. And because it is very clear that there's a reason why the police have to be organized in the kind of vicious manner that they have been organized. It is not an accident that the police behave like that. But don't forget that it's not just in Nigeria, in Africa, that you have cases of police brutality. You have it in the US, for instance, something which led to the Black Lives Matter movement. And what that demonstrates really is that the police are actually part of the instrument of class oppression that any capitalist state have for the purpose of maintaining stability in a society where you have the haves who are just a minority and you have a majority who are wallowing in misery. You need a force that is coercive to keep peace, aka law and order.
Okay, so from your perspective, the protest would challenge even the fundamentals of our system.
It has to.
Okay. Let's move on. Just a few weeks ago, you've mentioned it a few times. On the 13th of February, there was another attempt to stage a protest at Lekki Tollgate. The people that mobilized for that cited a ruling by the panel of inquiry looking into police brutality and other injustices by the police, during the protest and even before then, that Lekki Concession Company should be handed over, or the tollgate should be handed over to the Lekki Concession Company. Does that deserve a protest? It's just a ruling. It is not judgment yet. The panel had not made any categorical pronouncement. The tollgate operators had not announced when they are going to start. The ruling, Lekki Concession Company should take over the tollgate. Does that deserve a protest?
Don't forget that that ruling was more or less like the last straw. Right from the inception of that panel, there have been many indications that has been creating concern among protesters and among Nigerians about whether or not that panel itself can be trusted to genuinely deliver justice. Don't forget the controversy over whether or not the panel could invite the military, only for the military to then reluctantly agree to appear before the panel. Something we showed to a lot of people that apparently the panel lacked the appropriate power to even deliver on its assignment. Because if a panel that is meant to serve justice cannot even summon the military, which is a major accused agency in the whole crisis, then apart from that, there was also the demolition of the settlement around the Lekki toll gate. There were other developments, all of which.
What direct link do you see between the protests and people living in shanties in an environment like that
The
that
people
appear
living in the
to
shanties,
be improper?
they witnessed the atrocity committed on that night. There was a report carried out by Premium Times, which documented the testimony of occupants of that shanty about what they saw and who played what role. So that the demolition raised fear that the state was actually trying to cover up.
The people that live in that area, they were witnesses. Are they before the panel? Are they giving evidence? Are they testifying before the panel? And what does demolition shanties, you agreed shanties is from your word, what does it do in stopping them from testifying if they need to?
It does, because what that means is that you have dispersed them.
Okay.
And that means that if the lawyers to the NSAS protesters wishes to invite anyone from that settlement to testify, the state had already carried out a step that could make that difficult. If, for instance, the key elements had been dispersed.
Okay. Now,
but beyond that,
okay,
there were also many other instances. Including, there were many of the NSAS protesters who also were to testify at the panel, who were receiving death threats. There was the step taken by the CBN, to close their account. There was the attempt to stop some of them from traveling, including the withdrawal of their travel documents. So all of these activities and steps by states.
If somebody is involved in a suspicious activity, there's no categorical statement on that. If somebody is suspected to be involved in an activity that is illegal, does being involved in NSAS protests give that person a liberty, or pronounce the person not guilty? Wouldn't the agencies be allowed to continue carrying out their job? For instance, after the accounts were frozen, the court gave an order that they should be unfrozen because they didn't find anything that warrants that, and it was obeyed.
No, not because they didn't, because the step taken by the CBN was illegal, was completely, unnecessary, was actually vindictive. And we mentioned the illegal activity. Which of the NSAS protester organizers was accused?
I'm just making.
Nobody was accused.
I'm creating a scenario where it may not be proper.
But there was no such scenario, because it would have been a different thing. For instance, if any of the NSAS organizer or protesters was accused of any wrongdoing,
when somebody
and it was on that basis that you then freeze the account or prevent anyone from traveling, then it would be a different case.
Perhaps they were carrying out investigation. When they found out that the investigation is not necessary or does not hold any water, the court overruled them, and then the accounts were opened.
It was vindictive.
Okay, good.
And that was why it became clear, especially with the step taken, the ruling of on the LCC, that this was no more a judicial panel.
One of the things they talked about, when campaigning for the February 13 protest was that justice has not been served for those people that were killed during the protest at that toll gate. But that leads me to ask, who do you think deserve justice as a result of the protest and events of the aftermath?
Everybody.
Okay.
Whether or not you have had direct experience of police brutality, everybody deserves to live without fear. Okay. So that justice, therefore, is not just the restitution of compensating or admitting to what has been done. It also means a complete change in the way policing is carried.
So, in other words, there are people that deserve justice, they are dead, and there are people that are living that deserve justice too.
Those who have lost loved ones, those who have lost limbs,
whose businesses were affected. Now, do you think that another protest that could inflict more harm on the citizens should be encouraged?
It wasn't the protest that inflicted harm on citizens. Okay. It wasn't the protest that led to the destruction. It wasn't the protest that led to the arson. We must be clear about that. It was the ruling elite, principally Lagos State government,
the arson which created in many places.
I'm talking of Lagos.
Burning down of, it's a national thing.
But in Abuja, for instance, the federal government was involved. Okay. The driver of the Minister of State, Kayamo, was killed, I think. And how did that happen? It was because many of these politicians were actually mobilizing their megats, their domestic staff and co to join the band of thugs that they unleashed on the protest in Abuja. Here in Lagos State, the thugs were ferried by buses belonging to the state government.
That claim had been disproved.
By who?
Well, it's in the media, but let's move on.
It can't be disproved because this is what we saw. Okay. I could have been killed. Okay. I could have been killed. So this is not what the governor says. The governor was not there. It's about what we saw. And we are citizens of this country. We saw thugs who were ferried.
Let me ask this question so that you go on. The arson that were carried out during that period were not restricted to Abuja and Lagos. Many states saw police stations being burnt down, and anything that belongs to government was seen as not to be spared. Looting took over everywhere, and these things were results of days of protest. Now, do you think that since you have said by yourself that everyone deserves justice, even the people that are dead and the people that are living, do you think that another round of protests calling out people to the streets, do we deserve it now?
We deserve a protest, a peaceful protest, which ends us worse before the state intervene with their talks. What we don't deserve is for the state to mobilize talks in order to hijack a peaceful protest and turn it to what happened across the country in October. Because when you ask the question that the same destruction took place everywhere, so it's not just about Lagos State government, you are correct. But that's because the same thing that was done by the state here in Lagos and in Abuja was done by the state everywhere across the country, including Osun State, including Oyo State.
Okay, so
thugs were unleashed.
So wherever the protest went,
soldiers were deployed to attack
wherever the people that were deprived of their daily business, bus drivers that were no longer working, bus conductors that were no longer working, and these people live by what they earn per day. And by the time they are hungry for days, they now come out to the streets and begin to engage in crime and violence. You're saying that it's the state that sent them.
The bus drivers, the conductors, have been in struggle for years, including in major strikes of the labor movement, one of which was in January 2012. uprising, a 6-day general strike. There has been no time in this country that talks or that bus conductors or drivers will willingly attack a protest. Really, in every instance, bus conductors, drivers, they have always been allies of any genuine people's struggle.
I just used them to give an example of people that
anywhere
you see earning were deprived
anywhere you see them behave like that, it's only because they've been mobilized by the state.
Part of the people that lost a lot during that protest is the police. The police generally in Nigeria lost 22 of their men during the NSAS protest, and that's huge. But it is the biggest concern now is what are the Nigerian youths thinking? Because very soon another election will come. This is a democratic system where people emerge as leaders through the ballot box. What are the Nigerian youths doing to mobilize themselves to have a voice even as the election comes closer? Because it's said that a lot of people a lot of young people don't get involved in the electoral process.
In my own organization, the Youth Rights Campaign, we're already working towards that through the Socialist Party of Nigeria. We think that the young people, the working people of this country, need to use the coming election to make a stand. But we also must make a point very clear. It's not just about putting the youth in power. It's actually about putting a political party and with socialist idea in power.
Well, everybody must not be socialists.
Why?
A lot of people do not believe in socialism.
It's not about everybody being socialist. It's about if we have experienced for the past 6 decades of Nigeria's existence, if we have experienced this same crisis of mass poverty in the midst of abundance, then we ought to begin to do things differently. And the only alternative to this capitalist cul-de-sac we have found ourselves is a democratic socialist alternative, one that ensures that the abundant wealth of this country is placed under the democratic control and management of the working people, to ensure that there's provision of free education, jobs for all. Jakonde just died a few weeks ago, and everybody celebrated his passing. He was no socialist, but between 1979 and 1983, he demonstrated what was possible, even on the basis of using public funds to provide basic amenities. How much more a socialist government that places the resources in the hands of the working people instead of in the pockets of the rich, how much more would we be able to achieve? That's the kind of vision that we have in the Socialist Party of Nigeria.
You believe in socialism. Many other people do not believe in that, but it's important to allow everyone a level playing ground during the elections to participate and see how much of a conviction they will be able to make in the hearts of the people. That's a nice place to end it. Hassan Taiwo, the spokesperson of the Youth Rights Campaign. Thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me, sir.
And to you that watched, it's our pleasure that you did. Thank you so much for watching.